I'd like you to not turn your Bibles to the book of Revelation. Right? Some of you get that. Today we're going to be in the Old Testament, the book of Judges, chapter 5. I had the sense that as I was starting to prepare for today, that there might be something that overlapped with our celebration of motherhood, and I was not disappointed. We're going to be looking at chapter 5 as a retelling of chapter 4. God's Word does this quite often, and so it's really cool when you see it happening just one right after the other. Chapter 4 is the story of what I call the Battle of Mount Tabor. There's a bad guy, there's army, there's a fight, there's bloodshed. Make a very good Mel Gibson movie. He hasn't got around to it yet. And then in chapter 5, you have Deborah telling the story that you just read in chapter 4, only she's telling it as a poem, as a worship song. And so you get to sort of see how chapter 4 is interpreted by chapter 5 right away. It's very cool. So in order to understand chapter 5, you need to know what's involved in chapter 4, what's included there. It's actually not very complicated, and probably most of you have heard the story time to time yourself. You may even remember flannel graph figures associated with some parts of the story. Not every part of the story would make it flannel graph, just a warning. However, there it is. I find it helpful sometimes to actually look at a map of the region that's being discussed in God's Word. And so what I've done for you is I've put this as a sort of a big picture map of the entire nation of Israel as it was portioned out during the time of the Judges. So just to give you a couple of quick reference points, down here is Egypt. They came up from Egypt. They crossed the Jordan River is right here into the Promised Land. Now this is before David, so this is still in the time when they really hadn't gotten a firm grasp of the entire country yet. So up here is the Sea of Galilee. This is where Jesus would do so much of his ministry and would live. This is the Dead Sea, and they're connected by the Jordan River. And this Jordan River is actually in a really, really deep valley. So as you come towards Jordan River from the wilderness, you hit this range of hills and you go down into the valley. And then you come back up out of the valley as you move towards the west. So there's these hills here, and then you have a lot more flat farmland plains the closer you get to the Mediterranean Sea. Now the reason I'm telling you all this is because it actually has an effect on the story. The story begins with Deborah, and Deborah actually has sort of put up shop here, so more in the southern region. The villain comes from way up here in the north. In fact, I'm going to zoom in for you a little bit so you can see. This is the Dead Sea region kind of blown up a little bit. And this is a natural defile. It's one of the many routes that people would walk, and they called it a road. It wasn't like they built it. It was an easy route to take through the hill country. And this is where Deborah, the judge and prophetess in Israel, did her judging from. People would come to her, and she had a palm tree. Probably she had a tent or a number of tents set up. There was a palm tree there, and so people associated that with Deborah. And it was in between Bethel and Ramah. So on this main artery, goes north-south, this is where people would come to bring their problems and issues to Deborah, and she would solve them. Very close to Bethlehem, and this spot right here, where you don't see any name, the city of Jerusalem is right there in that area. But in the time of Deborah, it was still a Canaanite stronghold. David would not conquer that for another 200 years. So you've got some cities, some regions are Canaanite, some areas, some cities are controlled by Hebrews. And one of the big challenges that they faced, now we're going to go and look at the northern part of that map, and zoom in on that. One of the biggest challenges they faced was jamming the king of Hazor, or Hatzor. Now we have excavated Hatzor. Archaeologists have dug down to the bottom. They know what it looked like and how it was laid out during the time of Deborah. It's all right there. If you know the right people, you can see it for yourself. So what happened was, there's a guy who lived in this area near Kadesh Naphtali, and his name was Barak. And Barak received a message from Deborah, I need to talk to you. So he went south all the way down to just past Bethel. And she said to him, and this comes from chapter 4, verse 4, "Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, go, gather your men." And now I'm reading verse 6, "Gather your men to Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali, people of Zebulun, and I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, and meet you by the river Kishon with chariots. His troops I will give them into your hand." Now, here are some of the reasons why that was a big deal. The king of Hazor, his name is Jabin, had 900 iron chariots under the control of a general named Sisera. Those 900 iron chariots represented the most overwhelming military force in that whole area of that day. It would be like he had a whole battalion of tanks, and Deborah's people are still riding on horseback. So he oppressed them, he lorded over the Hebrew people. They were, in fact, we were told in chapter 5 that people tried to avoid the main roads and the main arteries and stick to the side roads and take the long way around where they had to travel anywhere, because there was a high probability of running into one of these, or some of these chariots that just represented this overwhelming military force. So, up they go. They followed Deborah. Well, the reason Deborah went along is because, and I got to remember to tell you this part, is because in verse 8, Barak tells her, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." Deborah's response to him was, in verse 9, "Okay, I will go with you, nevertheless the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." That will very graphically actually come literally true later at the end of the story. So Deborah and Barak go up to Mount Tabor, right here, very close to Barak's home of Kadesh. And they mustered people from Asher and the tribe of Naphtali, the tribe of Zebulun, the tribe of Issachar, and thousands, tens of thousands of people. Now, the reason that they were mustering there on a mountain is because if you're trying to engage someone fighting with chariots, a mountaintop is a good place to get yourself ready to go. Because the chariots find it very difficult to go on steep, rocky, mountainous terrain. Now, there's a valley down there. So when Sisera learned that there were all these thousands of armed Hebrews gathering on Mount Tabor, he set up the call. He would have had chariots in the coastal regions, down here where it's a lot more flat and easy to control. And they all came and joined together at Megiddo. And from there, they went north and they engaged the Hebrews in the valley at the bottom of Mount Tabor. And what happened, we don't know the details, but what happened was there was a rout. And the chariots lost, the Hebrews won, and Sisera's army beat feet, and they made it all the way back to the Kishon River. They retreated to Harosheth Hagoyim. They were caught by the Hebrew army before they could rally, and they were wiped out. They were decimated. So everything that Deborah predicted turned true for Barak, including the fact that God was going to deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. Because at some point, my guess is it happened here, but at some point along this retreat, Sisera said, "You know what? The heck with this." And he took off and went back. He was probably trying to get back to the fortress of Hatzor, but he only got as far as the oak in Zananim. And there, he was stopped by a woman named Jael. Jael was the husband of a guy who had a nomad community here, and they had a sort of a peace agreement with the king of Hazor. So he felt safe. So she said, come on in here, I'll hide you. He comes into her tent. She gives him some food to eat. He's exhausted, he's been running, he's decimated. He lays down on the floor, and all of these nomadic tents had huge area rugs, these beautiful rugs. So they weren't, walking on dirt. And so she let him get down under that. She put the rug over him, and he went to sleep, as you would do if you were exhausted and you just had a good meal and you were all getting all warm and cozy. He went to sleep. No sooner did he go to sleep than Jael, anything can be turned into weapon. She took a tent peg in one hand. She took a hammer in the other hand. She put it right against his temple. And then she drove it through his skull and pinned him to the ground with a tent peg. Yeah. So that's the end of Sisera. That's the end of everything. That's the end of the story. They finally reach, Barak's army finally reaches the tents of Heber the Kenite there. And they say, have you seen Sisera? And she says, as a matter of fact, I have. He's in my tent. He's hammered. They go in. They see him and then Deborah writes a song about it. Because there was a time when worship songs really, really rocked. Okay, so that's the story of the Battle of Mount Tabor. And here are the main points in no particular order. Deborah was the judge, the prophetess in Israel. She called Barak to lead the army. He conditionally agreed to lead. If you go with me, sure, yes. Deborah and Barak together led an army representing some of the tribes. If you read the Song of Deborah, you see that she calls out the tribes who didn't join them by name. Sisera fled. He hid in the nomad community of Heber the Kenite. Jael, acting alone, finished him off. And then God avenged Israel's enemies and delivered them from oppression. That is the gist of the story. That's it right there. Now, some parts of that, as you know, would make a good flannel graph. Some parts maybe you want to save for later. Yes, Sisera died. Don't ask how. It just happened, okay? When you read a story like that, one of the things you wonder is, why is that story in the Bible? What's that story doing there? What are we supposed to learn from it? And you can figure that out by asking more specific questions. You might, for example, ask, what can we learn from Barak's role in all of this? What can we learn from Deborah's role in this battle? And most importantly, what does this story tell us about God? What does it tell us about God? So if you're looking at Judges chapter 5, we're going to use Deborah's song as the interpretation of the battle that she's singing about. And this is where it begins. Chapter 5, verse 1. Then sang Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, on that day, that the leaders took the lead in Israel, that the people offered themselves willingly. Bless the Lord. That's the starting point right there. Now, the reason I want to pause on this is because sometimes, and I've heard this myself, sometimes when we tell the story of Deborah, Barak kind of gets put down in a way. You didn't want to go to battle unless Deborah went with you. What are you? A wimp? A sissy? You have to have her there to prop up your emotions or your courage? Are you scared? I've heard that interpretation quite a lot. There's even some Bible commentaries out there that say this was such a shameful thing that God used a woman to kill Sisera in order to bring more shame on Israel. And I actually don't buy that, and the reason I don't buy that is because that's not the interpretation that we see here in chapter 5, verse 2. What Deborah says about the situation is the leaders took the lead in Israel. Leaders, plural. Who's that referred to? The only two leaders in the story are Deborah and Barak. So what she's saying is that she and Barak together were able to take the initiative, step up to the plate, take the lead, do the thing that God had called them to do, that he wanted them to do. In other words, there's no shame here for Barak. Maybe he didn't get to really put the final touches on the death of Sisera, but there's no reason for us to think that that is something that somehow shamed him. The leaders took the lead in Israel. Now, how are we to square that together? Is it possible that the conversation between Barak and Deborah went something like this? God has called you to lead the army, you're going to attack, and God is going to deliver them into your hands. What do you say? And he said, sure, as long as you go with me, then I'll do this. And she says, okay, well, you've realized that you do that, then the glory of killing your enemy is going to be done by a woman. That's fine. I don't care about that. I'm here to make sure the job gets done. I'm not here to claim credit. Now, this is a slightly different way of imagining the story, but it's very easy for me to imagine because of a guy named Bill Bruce. You don't know Bill Bruce, but I remember Bill Bruce because Bill Bruce was a guy who taught my Sunday school for one semester, 1 year, when I was about 2nd grade. Now, I didn't know much about Bill Bruce when I was a child. All I knew was that me and my 2 best friends were in that class. We were swirly, we had too much energy, we had too much popcorn or whatever, and it could not have been easy for anyone to teach me as a child Sunday school lessons. And to be fair, Bill Bruce probably had it harder than the kindergarten teacher because I was in that class. I was not the best Sunday school student as a child. Don't tell my kids that. And Bill Bruce, he always looked a little bit nervous all the time. He just did. You know, his eyes always looked like they were wide open, even as if he had just been surprised by something. And he never spoke much. He told us the stories. You know, he prayed with us. He didn't talk much, though. He didn't laugh like the other adults in my church. And I must have asked my parents about it once. Because even as a child, I could tell that there was something about him that wasn't the same as some of the other adults that I was used to. And I was a child, and I was learning how to read facial expressions and so forth. And so my parents, they shared with me the only thing they could, the only way that they could explain it back in the early 80s. And they used the phrase shell shock, which today we know as PTSD. I didn't know anything about trauma as a child, or Vietnam, or what it's like to transition into civilian life after going through something like that. All I knew is that he was there. He was there. Now, the reason that this story makes me think of Bill Bruce is because at the time, our Sunday school, the person who was the CE director of our church, the Sunday school superintendent it was called, in charge of every single class and every single teacher, was a woman named Alice. I remember her too. Alice Fattinger was her name. I could imagine very easily a conversation like this. Bill, we need someone to teach the boys' Sunday school class. And you know what it's like to be a boy. Could you do it? Okay. If you pick the curriculum, and if you acquire the lessons, and if you get the books, and if you set it all up, I'll do it. But if you don't do that preparation for me, then I won't do it again. Okay, Bill, I can do that, but you're never going to win Teacher of the Year award. It's okay, I don't need an award. Kids need a teacher. And here I am. I remember 40 years later, I remember that he was there. Which also reminds me that we need a Sunday school teacher for the kids. You don't have to be the world's best teacher. You don't even have to be a female to teach kids, to be there, to read the Bible story. If you're interested, talk to Debbie Jones. So here's Barak, getting perhaps not as much credit as he deserved, but he stepped up. He did what he was supposed to do. He did what he was called to do, what God wanted him to do. And that was enough. He shared the glory of this victory with other people. Is it possible that he wasn't being cowardly? He was just being humble? Of course it's possible. Because if that's true, it wouldn't be the first time that people have mistaken humility for weakness. And it also wouldn't be the last time that people mistook humility for weakness. Now, in verse 7 of chapter 5, Deborah talks about her own role in this, and she says, the villagers ceased in Israel. They ceased to be until I arose. I, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. That's right. Deborah arose as a mother in Israel. Because the people were in trouble, the people had lost focus, the people had turned away from God, and they needed protecting. Who better to raise to leadership when someone has turned away from God and needs to be protected than a mom? In fact, I gave serious consideration to calling this sermon Fight Like a Mother, but I thought that might be misunderstood, so I decided not to do it. So she's called to leadership. And she rises to the occasion. When other gods were chosen, it says in verse 8, when war was in the gates, was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 Israel? In other words, nobody was standing up to resist either the idolatry or the oppression. So God raised up a mother. This is the most natural thing in the world. Moms are given by God's grace an instinct to nurture and to protect and to make sure that their kids turn out right. It's like the driving motivation of any mom I know. Where does that motivation come from? Well, God gave it to moms, didn't he? Of course he did. But where does it come from? Is it something that he just invented because he thought, oh, that sounds like fun? Or is it something that came from his own heart? You see, when God created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, he created them both in his image. But parts of God's heart does a mom reflect? The desire to nurture, the desire to protect, the desire to defend? Yes, all of those things. It reminds me of someone else who used a very, very motherly image to describe God's relationship to Jewish people. In Luke 13, when Jesus looked at Jerusalem, knowing that it was going to be destroyed very soon, he said, how I have wanted to gather you together to myself, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But you weren't willing. You weren't willing. So this instinct to fight for her children, to protect them, to get them back on the straight and narrow, of course, Deborah was the person for that job. And of course, Jael gets an entire stanza all to herself. The reason that I don't include her in the leaders in Israel is because what she did, that was an individual accomplishment. There wasn't her showing people the way. There was just her and Sisera. She got right to the point with him. And sorry, not sorry. She got right to the point with him and handled it herself. That wasn't a leadership role. That was a role that she was called to do because the opportunity arose, and she took the initiative. So good for her. I'm glad she got an entire stanza in this song. Then in verse 28, something really weird happens. Verse 28, the topic of motherhood comes up again. Only it's not Deborah celebrating her motherhood as a leader. It's Deborah talking to the mother of Sisera, the guy who just got killed. She's going to address Sisera's mother. Now, what is Sisera's mother feeling? Grief, anxiety. She's waiting for Sisera to come home, but he's late. Where is Sissy Poo? What's keeping him? Out of the windows she peered. This is verse 28. Out of the windows she peered. The mother of Sisera wailed through the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because all those years of oppression that he reveled in caught up to him. As it invariably will. It invariably does. We know that Sisera was the kind of general, the kind of leader who just wanted to take, and use people as possessions. We know that because in verse 30, this is a verse that tells us what Sisera's mom was hoping for her little boy, what she was expecting. She says this, have they not found and divided the spoil? She was expecting Sisera to gain victory in the field of battle and then take the goodies for himself. What goodies? A womb or two for every man. Spoiled dyed materials for Sisera. She's expecting, this is a mom, expecting her son to just take as a possession any women that he could take captive, and all his soldiers the same. You would think that a woman who's gone through all the pains of childbirth would have a little more sympathy for the women who find themselves underneath the power of a victorious army. But that was not the point of view in Hazor. See, sometimes a woman may think that she's standing up for what she deserves or for her rights, but what she really is doing, without realizing it, perhaps is standing up for selfish desires. And sometimes when that happens, other women get devastated in the process. And we're seeing some of that in our day and age, even this very week. You have ears to hear, I'm here. Deborah's point of view was completely different. What she wanted was peace, if possible. She wanted her people to be safe. She wanted them to follow God and to be safe. That's what she wanted. Is it really possible to summarize the heart of any mom more succinctly than that? I want you to follow God and to be safe. Of course, that's the heart of a mom. Of course, that's what Deborah expresses in this song. Oh, she also wanted one other thing too. And this, I think, was expressed when she sent a message to Barak and said, come meet me at the palm. She wanted her children to step up and to stand against unrighteousness and to do something about it. It's not enough to follow God and to be safe. Safety is fine as long as that's what's called for. More often, I think, we find that what's called for is the responsibility, the obligation, the call to step up and to do something, even if it takes courage, even if the thing that's facing you is overwhelming forces, power that you can't even begin to imagine. How are we going to overcome that? God will hand them to you this day. And surprise, surprise, he may even use a woman to deal the killing blow. The reason that I turn to the book of Judges and the story of Deborah is because our nation today we're at a crossroad, aren't we? I mean, in a way, we're always at a crossroad. You're always at a place where you could go one direction or another. It feels especially strong that day. But the story of Deborah gives us hope. I mean, how many of you need hope every time you go online or watch the news? Man, I need some hope. Take a look at Judges 4, verse 3. In Judges 4:3, it says this: the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help. For Sisera had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. Now, that's a lifetime for some people. 20 years. Now look at chapter 5 and verse 31. Look at how the story ends. So may all your enemies perish, O Lord, but your friends be like the sun as it rises in his might, and the land have rest for 40 years. The oppression which came as a result of their idolatry lasted for decades. But the peace that God brought in the wake of their victory when they turned back to Him was twice as long as the time of oppression they had just lived through. And that is the way it is with God. His mercy, it always abounds forever and forever. Habakkuk 3:2 says, Lord, I've heard the report of you. I have heard the report of you. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. This crossroads that we're standing at, as a nation, we can pray for revival. We can pray for God to get hold of us again in the midst of the years. We can do that. We can pray for that. We can rediscover who God is. We can rediscover what His will is. We can recommit to it as people, as Americans, as a church. But I'll tell you this. If we do, it will not be because we've abandoned the idea that God gave us of God the Mother. I'm going to ask you to stand with me as we close the service.